Welcome to Met Encounters, Zemí in the city, Cemí in la Ciudad. I am a woman with long brown hair. I'm in front of a brick wall and a beige velvet curtain. I'm wearing a polka dotted dress. I am Elizabeth Grady, Civic Practice Project Manager at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I'm privileged to be speaking to you from the ancestral homelands of the Canarsie people and respectfully acknowledge the Met's location in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape diaspora, and historically a gathering and trading place for many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work in the island. Encounters is a program designed to engage the Met's audience in timely and urgent discussions about objects in the Met collection. Throughout today's conversation, I encourage you to put your comments and questions in the chat in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the window. We're also offering closed captioning, which you can turn on or off using the CC icon towards the bottom right of your Zoom toolbar. Tonight, I invite you to join an interactive discussion about the contemporary resonance of Taino art that considers questions like, how does the Met represent Taino art? And how is it symbolically recontextualized in diasporic communities throughout New York City? We'll turn to questions and comments from the chat at the end of the presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce Miguel Luciano, Civic Practice Partnership Artist in Residence at the Met, and James Doyle, Assistant Curator of Arts of the Ancient Americas at the Met. Miguel and James, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And Miguel, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us tonight. Yes, of course. So I'm going to share some images so we can start talking about some of your past work. So tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you approach your practice.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you to everybody that's tuned in. Thanks, James, for helping to make this talk happen. My work is multidisciplinary, and so I do painting and sculpture and also public art work and a lot of sort of public art projects. So what's on screen right now is a public art project that is connected to bike culture, specifically Puerto Rican bike culture in New York. I'm riding here on a piragua cart / bicycle called Pimp My Piragua with the classic riders in the Puerto Rico Schwing Club in the Puerto Rican Day Parade 2 years ago when we had parades. And this was in 2019 in Brooklyn.
So what is a piragua? Tell our
piraguas are like snow cones, like it's shaved with, but it's made manually, right, on a shaved block of ice. And so this is a very fancy, piragua cart that's all decked out with speakers, sound system, neon lights, but still fully functional. And so it really is a project that was inspired by piragüeros and the culture that exists in our communities, and it was always made to return to the communities that inspired it. So it's it's a show bike in museums when it's in that context, but really where it comes to life is in the streets where it was inspired. So these are images from Bushwick from 2 years ago, and if you're outside of New York and you didn't know it, like, this is Puerto Rico week this weekend. Ordinarily, we would have the Puerto Rican Day Parade this Sunday, and we are having, I guess, some version of it, but the Bushwick version is happening, smaller version this year. And we're finally kind of getting back into the public sort of celebration. So
you mentioned bike culture. So I want to talk about this work for a second. So describe what we're looking at here.
So this is very much inspired by, again, the Puerto Rico Schwinn clubs and the way that we celebrate Puerto Rican culture on bikes in New York City. And so this is a project called Double Phantom that was made with two 1952 Schwinn Phantoms that were joined together at the back wheel. 1952 was the year of Puerto Rico's constitution, the year we became a commonwealth or a neo-colonial state, depending on how you look at this. And we, one side here represents the United States, the other side represents Puerto Rico, and neither side can go forward without the other side going backwards. So it is, inherently sort of like a project that's about our political dysfunction, despite the neon sign behind it that says "Go forward," right? Pa'lante, para adelante. So this is in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum right now. It's currently on view there. And this is kind of where the sculpture sometimes also arrives. and work that's functional and public, and others, that are in museum spaces.
Now, I also want to ask you about how you've engaged with ancestral imagery from the past, from Taino civilizations, because that's what we're focusing on tonight. So tell us a little bit about this work here.
So this is a part of a series of paintings I've been doing for years called Luciano Puerto Ricans. And they're based on a series of packing labels for Puerto Rican branded yams and sweet potatoes. They were a popular yam variety in the 1940s in Louisiana. And so on these labels, many of which were really horribly racist kinds of images, they were the first representations of Puerto Ricans in the US. So this is a more recent painting from that series that I used to talk about the current crisis on the island, the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. This was done in 2017, which was the 100-year anniversary of citizenship for Puerto Ricans. And it was also sort of the height of the debt crisis in Puerto Rico.
So what is this image here that the sort of double-headed eagle is grasping? What are we looking at?
So these are, ordinarily they're yams or sweet potatoes, right? But the yams and sweet potatoes also share a resemblance to the form of the trigonolitos, of the three-pointed stones that are Taino artworks that were carved in the shape of these three-pointed stones. Many of them looked like yam kind of shapes. So it was kind of a natural sort of transformation where these yams became these objects, ancestral objects of protection and resistance. And so from this trigonolito, emerges this pitirre, this flying bird. It's a local bird in Puerto Rico, and these birds are set to attack the eagle/vultures, descending upon or preying upon Puerto Rico's vulnerability.
Excellent. And so there's other Taino imagery in some of your work. I especially like this sort of, you've described it as a guerrilla project. So what is the image here?
Yeah, so like the guerrilla kind of style
Yes.
art. Yeah, so because so this is the Taino sun symbol. That's a very popular symbol that you see everywhere on t-shirts and tourist shops, but they originated as petroglyph symbols that were carved into stone, and they're symbolizing the sun in this case. So it's a bike rack. It's a New York City bike rack that I made a Taino sun symbol form to lock onto these bike racks. So I wanted to be able to insert these in public space without permission, but as a way of sort of reimagining the city in the image of our own culture and history. And so if you're in El Barrio this summer, you may see one of these around in the neighborhood. But they literally lock onto the existing bike racks. And I think they actually improve the utility of the bike rack with more spaces to lock onto.
Yeah, definitely. So I also want to talk about this public art project that you did just in 2019, correct? And so it involves large photo murals. So who's the photographer? What are the scenes that you chose, and what's the significance for East Harlem?
So at the beginning of my residency at the Met, in the beginning of the Civic Practice Partnership residency, I was involved in this project about the history of the Young Lords in East Harlem. And so it's a project called Mapping Resistance, the Young Lords in El Barrio. And really it's about the activist history of the Young Lords who were a radical social justice organization that were fighting against oppression everywhere, and also fighting for the liberation of Puerto Rico. And they were inspired by the Black Panthers directly, and they formed a New York chapter in 1969, originated in Chicago in 68. And these images, the one before and this one, are images that are actually still up. So we took 10 images, all photographs taken by Iram Marestani, who was the original photographer of the Young Lords, and one of the founding members as well. He's a photographer, a very important artist in our community, born and raised in East Harlem. And this one is still up in the neighborhood. So is the previous one on Young Lords Way on 111th. This is on 99th. And this is one of the 10 that is no longer up, but that also told the history of where the office was. This is Denise Oliver, who was the first woman in the central leadership of the Young Lords. And this was taken by Hiram in the office space of the Young Lords that was originally on the same block where we put the photos. So all the photos were situated at the same location where they were taken, or as close as we could get to those locations, 50 years later in 2019. And we did walking tours, to really reactivate this oral history of a neighborhood that's fast changing. And so this was a way for us to also kind of push back against gentrification and reclaim the history of this neighborhood while people who helped shape it are still here to recognize it.
And speaking of those who helped shape the neighborhood, here you are with Hiram Marisani.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about Hiram and his role, not just in the Young Lords, but in the formation of El Museo del Barrio in the late 1960s, as well as, how is the Met involved at this point in time?
So, in our project, the Met became a partner in the project along with El Museo del Barrio. So the Mapping Resistance was a project that was hosted by Museo del Barrio, supported by the Met and several other grants. And Hiram and I have been working together for years. We're friends and neighbors for many years here. Hiram has a long history in East Harlem, as a young photographer, as an activist in the Young Lords, one of the original members, but he also helped form and support several cultural organizations, including El Museo del Barrio. He was actually, he worked there as a photographer in the late 60s, and by the early 70s became the interim director for several years. So he was actually Young Lord and museum director at El Museo at the same time. But in the late 60s, he worked with Marta Bonera Vega, who was the director of El Museo del Barrio, and they helped to organize and put together the art heritage of Puerto Rico, pre-Columbian to the present, which was an incredible collaboration between El Museo del Barrio and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1973, it opens here at El Museo del Barrio when they were in a storefront gallery space on 3rd Avenue and 107th Street. So this is an amazing image of the original facade of these. There were a couple of conjoined storefronts that was one of the early homes of El Museo. And so this exhibition was unprecedented. It was the first time that artwork from Puerto Rico in a survey this large was actually traveling to New York, right? And it opened first in El Museo del Barrio here.
I'll just also show a couple of images from our archives at the Metropolitan. Here we actually see one of the entrances that features in the center an ancestral stone figure, along with the bilingual texts, both in Spanish and in English. And that's a really wonderful sort of time capsule of this allowing access to Spanish-speaking neighbors at the Metropolitan.
Can I ask a question, James, about the bilingual text? This is also like a precedent at the museum, right? First time that there's a bilingual exhibition.
As far as I could tell, yes.
Okay.
There were some other smaller exhibitions that were incorporating school children's artwork that may have had bilingual titles, but for a large exhibition, I think this was the first one. And actually, so we see this this sort of partnership between the century-old museum at the time, the Met, and this emerging community-based museum. Like you said, this is a really big moment, and it's still remains one of the largest, or the largest, survey of art from past to present in Puerto Rico.
Yeah,
and here are some contemporary works from Puerto Rican artists living in New York at the time, which was another
and still living in New York. This is Jose Morales, who, by the way, still lives in El Barrio and an incredibly important artist in our community. And so I'm really glad we're showing this image. And this is he's one of the artists in this show, one of the only New Yorican artists in that show, by the way. There was only a couple of artists that were Puerto Rican from New York that were in the show. Most were from the island.
Well, for me as an archaeologist, I'm really think this is crucial that in this wide-ranging exhibition, it was really one of the earliest displays of Taino art as part of this long arc of creative expression in the Antilles, including Puerto Rico, of course. And you see projections or large petroglyph representations on the wall, but here we see some of these iconic Taino sculptures of Zemi images that we'll talk about in a minute, but yokes as well as other greenstone axes. So this is really a great breaking ground in the ancestral works as well. And just to start with Zemi, this is a term in the Taino language that has been defined as referring to spiritual and vital forces of deities and ancestors that permeated the Caribbean environment, but then was harnessed by artists through these sculptures, right? And just to end here with the Art Heritage exhibition, this catalog, which is actually available as a free PDF on the Met's website, I should note, on the cover, there is a drawing of this iconic Zemi petroglyph from the ceremonial center of Caguana, Puerto Rico. So it's, and this female figure was also featured on the facade of El Museo that we just saw. So I guess I will stop sharing for a moment and ask, what was the extended significance of the art heritage for Taino-ness as a part of the Puerto Rican experience?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I wasn't around when this exhibition happens, right? So this is, I was 1 year old when that happened, that exhibition. But it has been a focal point in my research at the Met because it's like, it's the sort of Puerto Rican show that happens there. It's the only one really that featured Puerto Rican artists, past or present. And there hasn't been another one like that since. So it's at a museo, I know from sort of interviewing folks who were involved, this was a major part of the mission was really to teach our culture and history, like, to our own people. That was El Museo's whole mission in the beginning. And it was both African and Taino that, they were teaching the sort of the root culture of who we are as people from the Caribbean. And so, these exhibitions were, from what I've understand and from what people have told me, they were the first time for many people that they're seeing some of these petroglyphs, or not petroglyph images, but also the Tainos, Semís, the trigonolitos, and other kinds of objects, like in New York City. So there's a whole generation here in the 70s coming of age, right, in the Nuyorican art movement, that I'm sure are incredibly impacted by this work, seeing Taino work, but also contemporary work, right, from the island in conversation with each other here in New York City. So a hugely formative experience, I think, for a whole generation of artists. And
say a little bit about the broader context here, as far as with the young lords, the sort of Nuyorican coming of age, and broader civil rights movements that were happening in the late 1960s and early 70s.
Well, this was, this is early 70s, right? The whole country is changing. I mean, there are many parallels, obviously, with the world we're living in today and the world that was shaped really by the civil rights movement, and all the movements for social justice that we see in the world today, are calling back to this history. So the very creation of El Museo del Barrio, for example, right, it's a museum that forms in response to the exclusionary histories and practices of museums like the Met or other mainstream institutions that for years, didn't show our artists, our history, our culture, et cetera. And so they formed to be an institution that was really a for us, by us institution in the beginning, to teach that history forward to our own community. And the Studio Museum emerges at the same time, and so there's a whole movement in the city, really to bring our work into the center, right, and to build institutions around it, and to also be in control of the way that we teach and learn about our history. That's
it's really wonderful to think about how an art exhibition can really position something like that. And I'll fast forward a bit to another exhibition that is currently on view at the Met. It is titled Arte del Mar, Artistic Exchange and in the Caribbean. And I'll just say a few words about the exhibition, and then we'll come back to you, Miguel, for your thoughts about these Zemis on view. There's now a new cast of Zemis on view in the Met, and there are 4 thematic sections for Arte del Mar, and we're thinking about the way Indigenous artists across the Caribbean region expressed widespread concepts of ritual knowledge, which that's the Zemi that we're talking about, through performance as well, and how that relates to political power. And just to orient everybody, so we make sure we're talking about the same thing, the Caribbean Sea was home to vibrant civilizations for really thousands of years before European colonization. And we're really focusing today on the Taino civilizations that inhabited the Greater Antilles and neighboring islands. So that includes Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, like we were just discussing. So we'll be focusing on Zemi today, but I want to encourage everybody to try and stop by the exhibition in person. There's also a bilingual presence online, and you can experience a real range of creative works throughout the region, such as gold and greenstone and ceramic objects as well. To return to our topic of Zemi, really thinking about how these artists harnessed this environmental power through sculpture. This is just an example of two duos. These are a type of portable throne. It's a ceremonial seat that the sculptors really do this wonderful job of fusing this graceful form of a fiber hammock. And just for our audience tonight, hammock is a word in English we use that is descended directly from the Taino word.
Yeah.
For
one of several words, in fact.
One of several, yes.
Right? Hamaka, barbecue, there's a whole
hurricane, iguana.
Exactly.
There's a lot. So what we are seeing, these four-legged identities that are fused with this hammock are other Zemis. These date to the 15th century, coming from the Turks and Caicos Islands. And we can imagine that this would have provided a really privileged vantage point for men and women leaders as the caretakers of these Zemis during ceremonies. These men and women were known as caciques. That's the word for the political leader of the Taínos. And they competed against one another for claims over territory and subjects. This is a Zemi that is in the exhibition. It's made of wood, and it's a reclining figure. And the surface of the body is has this flattened area that could have been used to consume ritual substances, which we'll talk about later. But what I want to emphasize with this image is that the trees themselves inspired the artist. So we actually see these crossed legs of this Zemi would have been something that the artist saw in the original medium itself, the wood. And you have this idea that there's some narrative that we're just missing, because the kind of arms behind his head and these curled toes, and he almost seems to be in distress. So it's part of this epic story that's potentially lost to time. And as Miguel, as you mentioned, the trigonolitos, these wonderful three-pointed stones, these are also known as zemis, and they have a beautiful range of different types of stone. These are all from Puerto Rico, and we have a range of images. This is an elder male emerging from the stone here. We have a sort of stylized face, and this one I particularly love. It's this very beautiful bird with wide eyes, and you can see the legs back here. And just to say two things about the three-pointed stones. One, as you pointed out, they are connected to root crops, the yucca or cassava.
So
and
like tubers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We know that from the accounts of Spanish colonizers, that they had this symbolic connection to agriculture. And we also think that they are a form of a tangible landscape. The mountains of Puerto Rico have this jagged form, and it could be a way of really having a portable, meaningful piece of the landscape with you. Just a couple more examples. This is maybe the smallest Zemi on view. It's a pendant, and it really shows the artist's dexterity at distilling all the salient features of these deities. He's got this smile and the posture, and these would have been worn for protective objects to adorn bodies. And one final point I'll make about Arte del Mar. So we've seen the ancestral Zemi works, but I think it was always important for me, as a curator and as an archaeologist to build a bridge to the present. And of course, from the 20th century to the present, people, artists in the Caribbean region and in diaspora communities have also been inspired by the environment and by the landscape of the region. So one final work, which is decidedly not from the distant past, this is from 1950, Rumor de la Tierra by Wilfredo Lam. And the point here is that Lam is reconnecting in the 1940s with his family roots and Afro-Cuban religions like Santeria and Lucumi, Santeria known as Lucumi or Voodoo, that he creates this sort of glossary of these flying creatures, and it's all referencing the ecology and religious practices and agriculture that is present in Cuba at the time. So we can imagine that this could spark a conversation about how are modern and contemporary artists in the Caribbean thinking about these legacies, both of indigenous and Afro-Caribbean visual forms.
Sure. No, I love that you included this painting. And if you go back one, can you just go back one?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. It's
That's
like,
all right.
I just wanted to point something out there that for me has been kind of important about the space. So first of all, the show's up for 2 more weeks. So if anybody listening has not seen the show, I highly recommend seeing it. It's a really special opportunity to see this work in a really special exhibition. And it's the last exhibition, right, that's going to take place in these galleries before the galleries close for renovation.
That's correct.
So it's up for June 27th. See how much I know about the galleries already?
You're a good spokesperson. Yeah.
But I mean, I'm super biased. I love this show. But what I love about the lamp painting in the very back is that in the placement of the painting also is literally at the midpoint between Africa and ancient Americas. And so this kind of pop-up space is the crossroads. And so for me, that crossroads is also the Caribbean, right? The Caribbean is the crossroads between Africa and the indigenous America that come to inform who we are, right? That are at the base of our culture, no matter where in the Caribbean that you're from. And so for me, this presented a really exciting opportunity to think about other possibilities where these kinds of exchanges can merge in contemporary exhibitions and historic exhibitions. Because too often we sort of learn about them in very fragmented ways. So I liked the inclusion of this painting to open up this conversation. Also towards the possibility of an expanded sort of Caribbean exhibition, maybe being in this space in the future.
Definitely. And I think I want to know what you thought about seeing some of these Zemi images for the first time in the exhibition. Because as you said, and I think this is true even as it was in the 70s, a lot of people haven't seen some of these objects firsthand. So what was it like to kind of encounter them?
Well, also to see them in conversation with other regions and other countries that we don't always connect them to, right? Like we often understand that Taino is as related to the island that we're from, and so it's and what's usually offered, honestly, is offered in a very modest kind of display, right? Like the Taino display at the Met usually is like one vitrine with like 6 or 7 objects or something in it, and it's a very humble presentation, and it's one of the only places that you see Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic or Haiti sort of represented at the museum. So it's a touchstone for so many people from the Caribbean, despite its modesty, and that's why I was really excited about this show coinciding with my residency, because it gave me a chance to go deeper into the collection, but also to really experience this exhibition as it was being created. So just for some background, my residency started in 2018, I think. And James, I probably started talking to you right away. You were one of the first curators that I met for the same reason. It's like the Taino collection is like one of the only representations of Puerto Rico. So I went there immediately because I'm trying to find out, where do we see ourselves in the museum? Like, where is our representation there? And it's always been at least there. So that was a starting place. And we'll talk in a moment, I think, about sort of where that led us.
Yes, and actually, what we'll look at now, we have a clip of your recent visit to Arte del Mar. This is coming from the recent Inside the Met documentary that is currently available through PBS. So our tech friends are going to show that to us now.
It's a really special object. It was probably used in ceremonies using this kind of hallucinogenic plant medicine. Similar, I think, to ayahuasca. It's probably from Haiti or the Dominican Republic, the island of Hispaniola. If it weren't for the museum, I would never have access to this thing. I'm grateful that it's here, but I'm also very conflicted by my experience of my own history and heritage that's limited by the museum in its kind of institutional framework that has always been a very colonial framework. And the acquisition history of so many of the objects that we find in museums in general share these kinds of colonial legacies. But it's not so simple as just returning them to where they came from, perhaps. Obviously, the objects, they're protected for preservation, but it prevents us from understanding them perhaps the way they were originally intended for us to understand them. And so how do we reimagine them in the spaces of our own community, as opposed to this very sort of like depersonalized, sterile form of engagement?
Wonderful, thank you so much. So let's zero in then on the wooden sculpture that you were just encountering in Arte del Mar. So I'll just describe briefly what we're looking at for our visitors tonight. We're seeing this is a sort of crouching, grimacing male figure. And he's adorned with a woven cap. He's got stretched earlobes with ear flares and bands on his arms and legs. And the dark wood contrasts with a very bright shell inlay that forms the teeth, and the eyes too, that have resin residues would also have held some type of inlay. And we have radiocarbon dating that tells us the creation was between roughly 974 and 1020 AD. So it's well over 1,000 years old. And just to show a close-up of the studio shot, the large head here is crowned by this hemispherical platform, which creates a flat surface on the top. And from that, people would consume cajoba. So you mentioned cajoba, Miguel. What's cajoba?
Well, cajoba is a plant medicine, a hallucinogenic plant medicine that was used in the Caribbean for different kinds of rituals to promote visions, right, in different ceremonies. And so this was kind of like a big pilon, you know, like that you would grind the cajoba powder on top of before it was inhaled by the vehique or the shaman, right, or whoever was conducting the ceremony.
Yes, and I'll zoom in on the reverse of the sculpture here because we see these sort of, the spine is really prominent and the ribs are sort of exposed. So it's really contrasting with the more muscular shoulders on the front. And the interpretation is that we may actually see these ritual acts in the Zemi itself. So you could think about ritual practices like fasting or purging or vision questing, if you want to call it that, that could be represented in this emaciated part of the sculpture. And we know these practices, of course, from the late 15th and early 16th accounts of the Spanish colonizers.
And there also were the vomiting sticks and other things that were, connected to the same or similar kinds of rituals. Because they were like hallucinogenic purgantes, I think, also.
And just to look at a close-up of the face, I'll emphasize that these Zemis had their own names and their own stories, right? So some have identified this particular figure with these, you can see these tears streaming down from the eyes. The sculptors kind of emphasize this with this relief here as a rain giver, as a deity that has specific role of bringing rain. And again, we'll emphasize that these sculptures with their caretakers really became agents in their own communities, right?
I love those details of the tears, those grooves. And I didn't see them the first time that I saw the sculpture right away, right? It's not until you study it and realize the way that they're so deliberately carved. And it could be identified with a couple of different deities associated with water, right? And with rain. So whether of the rivers or of the skies, is my understanding.
Yeah. I do want to mention a little bit about the sort of recent biography of the sculpture. So you've noticed that the preservation of the wood probably suggests this was placed reverently in a cave where it was protected from the elements. And we know that other Taino wooden sculptures that survive have been reportedly found in cave contexts. Most likely, and we don't know exactly, it was collected in the 19th or early 20th century and then taken to Europe, where by the 1930s, this Londoner, Edna Decane, she's pictured here, she reportedly obtained it from an estate in Dublin, Ireland. But she lived with the sculpture for a couple of decades, and the Zemi accompanies her in this 1938 portrait that was painted by English painter Carol Waite. We sort of see her longingly gazing at this sculpture, which she called her Arawak rain god. And I just wanted to read something in her own words. In 1954, when she wrote to Renee Darnancourt at Nelson Rockefeller's museum to offer the sculpture, she said, quote, "I want it to find its home in the Americas, where I feel it belongs, and where I feel it will be one of these supreme exhibits. Only through art and history can peoples be knit together, and this would help to knit the Americas. The Arawak rain god is every bit as important as any piece of early Greek or Egyptian sculpture, and indeed far more important than any Titian, Goya, or Renoir." So I thought that was an amazing account of someone that didn't necessarily know the entire history of the sculpture or its original context, but connected with the power of that visual impact that sculpture has.
So this is this is great. This is such a weird painting that I didn't see this until you showed it to me this week, which I couldn't believe it existed. But I'm trying to locate it in history, right? So this is in the 30s. This is the owner of the painting, or excuse me, the owner of the Zemí at this time, right? Who buys it from an estate sale in Ireland. And before that, its ownership and its history is unknown. Is that correct?
Right. Exactly.
Right. But then she ends up then selling it to the Rockefellers. Is that what happens?
Yes. So Nelson Rockefeller's Museum of Primitive Art it started in the mid 20th century, and in 1954 she wrote because she specifically wanted her sculpture to be seen in the Americas. And Rockefeller then acquires it, and it ends up in New York City afterwards. Yes, and here we see a couple of gallery views. This is 1957. This is perhaps the first time the Zemi goes on view in Manhattan. And you can see him gazing out here in this gallery. There were a couple of different exhibitions featuring the sculpture. This one in particular from 1964 is about wooden sculpture around the world. And so we see examples from the Americas. This is Chimu from the north coast of Peru. This is early classic Maya from Mexico or Guatemala. We have an Aztec wooden drum on the wall and a Cuacuacuac sculpture from the 19th century from the northwest coast. And we also see later in 1966, this installation where the Zemi is in conversation with other works from the indigenous Americas, including Mississippian sculpture, which is roughly contemporaneous from the US mainland. And then we have later works by Plains and the Northwest Coast sculpture, as well as Arctic masks, this Yupik mask there.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, so from here, so when does it come from this space to the Met?
So in 1978, 1979 was the full transfer of Rockefeller's collection from his museum and his personal collection to the Metropolitan. And in 1982, the gallery opened, the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing. So it's interesting to note that since the Zemi has been on view in the Rockefeller Wing, it has already been an inspiration to contemporary artists such as this wonderful Martin Wong painting.
Amazing painting.
It's amazing. And there's this diptych where we have the Zemi actually painted in the vitrines, likely at the Metropolitan, as well as an enlargement of one of the Taino pendants in the case. And there's also in the divider of the two canvases, Wong has written different businesses that are using the name Taino. So Taino's Discount Meat Market and Taino Restaurant and Taino Travel Inc. So he's
So
making, he's making this connection about the presence of Taino concepts in New York at the time.
Sure. I mean, I'm such a big Martin Wong fan. This painting is in the collection of the Bronx Museum. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, and they did a wonderful retrospective a few years back.
It's so what I love about this painting is that it shows a couple of things, right? That in the 90s and as far as long as this thing was presented, it's been a touchstone again, right? You know, for so many artists and people who connect with Caribbean history in different ways, right? And so it also here for me represents the conflict of the Cemí with the vitrine, right? Or the museum as a context. So it's like this cosmic sort of like space that exists around the Cemí as it sort of vibrates with this force field in the other objects. The other Cemí is kind of vibrating. It's like they want to bust out of there, you know? The Taino invasion from outer space, it's in that context, it is as if the Cemís are just visiting, you know? And so for me, I imagine their sort of departure also, right? In this way, or also their connection to a kind of cosmic world, right? And an awareness that connects us to the stars and to a larger kind of understanding of the universe and connection to the universe. So there's so many things that I love.
there's a lot going on in this work. So
but the piece on the right, the pendant piece, where's the pendant piece from? That's in the collection as well, right?
Yes, it's probably from the Dominican Republic or Haiti, from Hispaniola. And I do want to move on to your work with the Zemi, but first I just wanted to highlight this project that was inspired by some of the works in the Met's collection. So tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here.
Sure. So, I mean, during the residency, I've been thinking about different connections to the collection, and also, you know, that previous image reminded me so much of a shield, the Taino kind of image. And the Semís also are about protection, essentially, you know, and so another thing that was about protection, you know, were the Arms and Armors collection, looking a lot at these shields. I was going back and forth to Puerto Rico, also thinking about the protests in Puerto Rico in 2019. These are images of decommissioned school buses that really have proliferated on the island as schools have been closed. Hundreds of schools have closed due to extreme austerity programs that are a result of the debt crisis on the island. And so US interests that have created a huge debt crisis on the island, compounded with a lot of other local issues, has led to the closure of lots of schools. So we turned the school buses, the abandoned buses, into shields to protect protesters who are literally protesting to protect the education for the future of Puerto Rico's children. So this was a very much an ongoing thing. This is during the summer of Ricky Renuncia, getting the governor to resign in 2019. But the work was actually made last summer during really the height of protests here in New York and throughout the country during the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I was interested in those connections between what's happening in Puerto Rico and what was happening in the US for racial justice, for sovereignty and liberation. And so this is how these shields appear sort of collectively on a wall, literally sort of peeled off the side of decommissioned school buses.
So let's then talk about what led you after the Shield project to work with the Zemi in particular. We were able to work with our colleagues in imaging to create a three-dimensional model that you then were able to mill. But I wanted to ask about kind of this photo is from the day when you came to visit the Zemi in storage, and we got to see it outside of the vitrine. So what was your sort of first impression? What was your reaction in this moment?
So this is, I mean, this was a really humbling moment because again, we started this really in the beginning. So this project, it took a long time, you know, to get to this stage. This is the first time I had seen it without the glass. And you're looking at an object that's 1,000 years old, made from Guayacan, from one single piece of Guayacan wood, with these shell inlaid teeth. It was, I was very, very humbling. I felt very quieted by the experience. But you see it here kind of sideways, laying on a pillow before it's heading to the imaging department, where it was three-dimensionally scanned by all of this kind of high-tech scanning hardware.
And then, so what was done with that scan, and how have we been replicating our Zemi friend?
Okay, so the whole reason that I asked if we could do this was because I was interested in making a replica object, right? That could exist outside of the museum. And so when I learned about the technology in imaging, we scanned it. I took the scan then to a fabricator that carved a three-dimensional replica, and then that was made into, we molded that and cast it in different materials. So this is at one of the production shops, and this is sort of what some of them look like now. These are all kind of works in progress, and the whole project is still really a work in progress. But from the milled positive to castings and plaster to the centerpiece that is a solid blue resin casting that I've been working with most recently. And
yeah, and we actually have a wonderful clip from the same PBS documentary that I'll ask our friends to play now, in which you unveil this to Hiram.
Mm-hmm. So this is what I'm doing with the Met right now. We actually went to see Arte del Mar a couple weeks ago. The premier object in the show is the Cemí jojoba stand. This is a replica, the Cemí in blue.
Amazing, man.
This still needs a lot of polishing and stuff. Mm-hmm. The idea is to actually create a venue in El Barrio so we can actually introduce this to the community in a way where people can have uninterrupted access to it.
It's a great piece, man.
Thanks,
I really love it.
I mean, it's in process.
Yeah, no. This is a prime example of what a really good art project should be. You know, at the end of the day, we come from a colonized reality, and a lot of our history was denied us. Mm-hmm. And in that denial, we lost the ability to appreciate some of the indigenous elements of our culture.
What you just described, access to our own history, is really what drives this whole project. These were ceremonial objects. These were
religious objects.
They were, exactly. I've been thinking a lot about these ancestral connections, you know, even if we're reimagining them through this kind of, you know, this blue resin artifice. It's like, it's embedded in there somewhere, you know?
Miguel's Met project will now expand into the community. Regenerated, the 1,000-year-old figure will again, he hopes, promote unity and identity.
So let's take a look at how the Zemi will reach the community. And so I'll move forward here to this image. So what are we looking at here?
So this is a bronze. So I was able to create a bronze casting most recently that this is very new. This is one of the first images here that's being shared. And the idea the whole time really was to create a replica that could exist outside of the museum, you know, to imagine the Cemí really liberated from the vitrine that's held it for so long, and share it back with the community in a way where we would have a chance to actually learn from it directly, right? And experience it directly without a vitrine around it, and get up close and personal with it. And I myself I'm learning from it literally, like, you know, through this process. So it's an extraordinary opportunity, and I'm super excited to be able to present the work in El Barrio. And the first presentation of this work will be very soon, July 23rd. We're going to open a pop-up exhibition in El Barrio on 104th Street at Galería del Barrio, and it'll be up for a couple of weeks there for a small pop-up exhibition of work that has been produced through this residency and in connection with the residency. And the Zemi is really the star of the show. The whole purpose is to give our community a chance to experience the work directly. So I'm really, really excited about this project coming up.
Yes, it's exciting. And
yeah.
Before we, I wanted to be able to take some questions from our audience, but before we do, what are some of your final thoughts about your residency and, with this particular object, and tell us a little bit about El Met.
Oh yeah, okay. So that's another part of the project also. So my residency is culminating this summer. So we have the pop-up exhibition the last 2 weeks of July into the first week of August, and we're doing like a block party celebration on July 31st. All of this I'll be posting. And the Met will be posting, I think, in some shape or form. But I think the majority of the time my residency has been, researching really the archives to see where Puerto Rican and Latinx artists are represented, and also to try to expand that space, through the work that I'm doing, and it's been a work in progress to sort of like explore that potential. But the Zemi, making the replica as a way of removing the object from the museum as a context, really, and sharing it back with the community directly it took us about 2 years for this to be realized. And so I'm so excited that it's finally happening. And James, I really just want to thank you for supporting this work the whole time, and being so generous, with me, letting me go backstage and behind the scenes and experience. I mean, it's been an incredible thrill.
Thank you for being so thoughtful and really showing people at the Met and showing our public that these ancestral objects can be activated in a way that is that's addressing contemporary issues. And I think that's one of the goals of exhibiting objects that have this visual power to get people to understand the original context and the original function, but also come up with their own relationships and what it means to them.
Sure. And I see, as a Puerto Rican artist, when I go to the Met, if I'm looking for Puerto Rico and asking again this question, like where am I? Where is my work, or our history, or artists from Puerto Rico represented? There's only a couple places where anything from Puerto Rico exists, and it's in the Taino sort of pre-Columbian collection, and there's always just a couple objects on view there, and that's why the Taino collection was really a starting place. And this object is from Hispaniola. This is, really represents the beginning of the colonization of the Americas, in a sense, and it's a very symbolic object. One of the most extraordinary artworks that survives from all of Taino history, especially one that's made out of wood. So I'm incredibly honored to be able to work with this object. The other place that we have some representation is in musical instruments. There's a Puerto Rican cuatro and a maraca. That's another Taino instrument, but it's really, that's about it. And so, in response really to the underrepresentation of Puerto Rican and Latinx artists at the museum, I came up with another project, which is this T-shirt here. This is how it's kind of debuting, right? This, where I took the Mets logo. I'm wearing one too, right? But I took the Mets logo and I flipped it into El Met, and as a kind of provocation to really challenge the institution to think about the museum through the lens of Spanish-speaking people, right? And so the whole pitch was that I want to sell these T-shirts in the Met store, and I want all of the proceeds to go to the acquisition of Latinx art at the institution. And originally I just made the T-shirts. I didn't ask permission. I made these T-shirts, flipped the logo, and started giving them out in education and to other folks, but really trying to pitch this idea. And it's taken almost 2 years. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to actually announce this, and it's going to launch, and you'll be able to buy yourself a T-shirt that says El Met, yes. And all the proceeds are going to go to future acquisitions of Latinx art exclusively. So I'm really excited about that. And we haven't even announced this officially. So, but you heard about it.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. But it's coming soon, and you will be hearing about it. And so, yeah, I'm excited. That's one of the projects that's also, emerged through the residency.
Great. Well, stay tuned for El Met. It will come soon. But I'll ask Elizabeth to tell us if we have some questions that we can take in our final minutes here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much to Miguel and James. This talk has really provoked quite a bit of conversation. And I want to start out with a couple of related questions. The one is from Donna Robin Lippman, who asks, what steps can the Met take to remedy the situation you described so clearly of its presentation of Taino and Puerto Rican art and culture in a colonial context? And a related question from Verily Popeye, and forgive my pronunciation if it's incorrect, is that several Caribbean countries have started dialogue about the restitution of Taino art and artifacts that are held by major European and North American museums. Taino revival movements, for example, in Jamaica, in addition to older ones in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, are increasingly vocal about cultural ownership issues, particularly with regard to sites, items, and images of religious significance. So the question here is, since the Caribbean has a significant diaspora in the metropolitan North, the politics of access, ownership, and representation are complicated, which returning these objects to the Caribbean may not fully address. What are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on institution and how these things live in institutions?
Those are three very big questions. We could do a whole other event about that. But
that's why I kind of mushed them together.
But they're good questions.
Similar.
Excellent questions. I'll just say briefly about the organization of Arte del Mar. It was part of the Met's 150th anniversary for 2020, and the impulse was to really celebrate the exciting research that's been done in archaeology and art history in the entire Caribbean region, and to bring that together and to give it the platform that it deserves. I think as an archaeologist, when we study the past and in the indigenous brilliance, you often see in classes, you would learn about Mesoamerica, you would learn about the Maya, you learn about Aztec, you learn about South America, you learn about the Andes, you learn about the Inca, you learn about their predecessors. But I think there's such exciting new avenues of research in the Caribbean that can inform and actually change the way we think about ancient or ancestral politics and societies. And so going to the question of, really privileging that indigenous information and the indigenous concepts that we have now from this archaeology and ethnohistory was a real priority for Arte del Mar. And I think in the past, even presenting Taino art, there's been a sort of misunderstanding of the endurance and the survival of Taino peoples and ideas and religious practices and images. So it was really important to not speak about it as a time capsule as well. These are sort of strategies that we can take to make sure that audiences who are learning about the Tainos for the first time don't go away with these outdated modes of thinking about the ancestral Antilles, right?
Yeah,
Miguel,
and that also helps to answer another question, which was how the wall texts were made so inclusive. Someone had commented on that, and I wanted to uplift that because I thought it was
sure. Well, I'll say briefly about the wall text too. That's another way to privilege the indigenous information, and we workshopped the English and the Spanish introductory text to make sure that it was as inclusive and broad ranging as possible, so that it to give access to the largest amount of people. And we also included on the walls actual quotations from colonizers and called them that because they were the firsthand witnesses of this indigenous genius. And that's one way that we have access to this ancestral Zemi power and what it meant to the peoples who created these sculptures. So I think other things, just like I was talking about the Zemi, the hammock-shaped seats, just not calling them seats because that's not really conveying the spirituality of these objects. These are portable thrones, and you think about how can we elevate the language to talk about things that, people may not be familiar with.
Yeah, I just want to add that, I think part of the reason I did the replica with the Cemí is really, it's a project that's also born out of the frustration of experiencing the work through, as I said earlier in that documentary, like through this vitrine and pedestal, because it's so depersonalized, right? In that sort of context. And we never have had an opportunity to understand these objects in their original context, right? And that was something that was robbed, from us, no matter where in the Caribbean that you're from, over many, many centuries of violent colonial histories. And so there's always, I think, a difficult sort of coming to terms with our engagement in colonial institutions all over the world. Having said that, I think that these conversations are hugely important, like that for institutions to also host and engage with, right? And so how do we think about restitution for different objects, right? The Met just committed to giving back 3 Benin bronzes this past week, right? Which is extraordinary and long overdue. So, that's a step in the right direction, right? And so I think that there are things that can happen where that's possible. But it only happens through, I think, really more deeply engaged kinds of conversations over very complicated histories. So, as an artist, this for me, it was sort of a way of creating a provocation, but also trying to think about how to expand our experience really with our own culture, right? And so removing the Zemí from the vitrine is a step in that direction, because we have literally there's never been a replica of this object. We've never been able to touch it, to understand it, to get close to it. And for me, that's a really exciting idea, because, if you imagine that there is still sort of ancestral knowledge and awareness that we inherit across many, many generations, that there's a lot that we may come to understand beyond the labels on the objects.
Exactly. And there's that sensory experience,
exactly,
right? Of the, I love looking at the bronze sculpture, because it captures the texture that is, part of the biography of the object. You can imagine the different substances or the different decorations or the different contexts in which the Zemi was. And that's all legible now in the replica, which is really exciting. And I think, I thought, wow, that's got to be heavy, but the wood is really heavy.
It is.
So
it's dense.
there is there's this connection too in the materials.
And the wood is, Guayacan is literally translates to ironwood. So that's the original wood that this was carved in. And that's a significant piece of Guayacan. You don't find pieces like Guayacan trunks that are usually that large. It's very, very difficult to find today. So there's so many levels of special, with this object.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any other final questions? We're 5 minutes over, but I think if people are willing to stick around, and Miguel and I can maybe address one more thing.
Yeah, there was a question about indigenous objects conversing, indigenous objects conversing with one another. And Miguel, it made me think about the context that you're creating with the exhibition in El Barrio, with the object in conversation with the community, in conversation with contemporary art, in conversation with the exhibition, The Art Heritage of Puerto Rico. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about how the work can talk to other objects, to us today, to the community in East Harlem, or whatever else drops into your mind in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this pop-up exhibition is a very small space, but that will have a collection of objects in it. But really, they're all objects that reflect the community, the community's culture back to it in a different way. And so there are references to the Met and the collection, but there are also references to our neighborhood and our culture and history that merge in this space. And so I'm interested sort of in how all of that sort of, comes to life in even a small way. And I'm also interested in how we can celebrate those connections in this block party that'll happen on the 31st. So it's really about celebrating community. And it's been such a difficult and painful year for so many of us that I'm just excited for the opportunity to hold some space for us to be together. And I'm proud that this work can help offer sort of those connections.
Wonderful.
Great. There was one other question that I think it doesn't quite as directly relate to exchange and communication, but it does kind of tie back to the historical context for the work, or prehistorical, you might say, which is, there's a question about whether there was regular cultural interchange among the peoples living in all the Caribbean islands and also with the mainland. And I think that notion that this isn't just a tiny little, sort of thing, this is like a really expansive, is something, James, you might be able to speak to.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll say another Taino word that we use is canoe, because
Canoa.
they were very avid seafaring peoples in the Caribbean. And so we know that there were waves of migration as early as the 3rd millennium BC, probably, to the islands, and that didn't stop. And so there was a lot of exchange. And that was another goal of the exhibition, is to bring together the conceptual, the material, and the visual connections that we see, because I would imagine that all these peoples, like in Colombia, in Panama, and Costa Rica, had their own idea about Zemi, and even if it wasn't called that, if a Taino person was traveling around and they were wearing something that was made of a special material like greenstone, it would have been this kind of transcultural symbol of political power. And so that's another theme that's borne out in the exhibition, is imagery of flight, for example.
Right. But there are also references in the exhibition to where different kinds of stones appear in different regions that we know are connected at some point because of the different materials that arrive and sort of move through those spaces, right?
Absolutely. And we know that jadeite, for example, is a very specific source in southern Guatemala that shows up in Costa Rica, and it shows up in Vieques, Puerto Rico, very early on.
That's amazing. Yeah. So I think that's a really good point, because even with these objects, this Zemi, the Cobastan, is 1,000 years old. And it's assumed that it was in the Dominican Republic or Haiti because of the caves within the landscape that could have protected it, right? But with so many of these objects, there is no absolute sort of knowledge about where they actually came from, right? We know they're Taino, we know that they came from the Caribbean, from different islands, but a lot of this is the guesswork of the scholars, right? Based on what the scholars have learned so far, right? But it's not certain.
Exactly. And I think the fact that we see things exchanged so widely confounds the identification of the original makers of these works, but it's an ongoing process. And like I said, the publication for Arte del Mar has a great bibliography to look at some of the great research that's currently being done in the islands by our colleagues in archaeology and art history. So I would encourage our viewers to check out that for more information. But I think we're about 10 after, so I think we'll wrap it up, Elizabeth, unless you think there's a burning question we need to address.
No, I think that we've managed to get an awful lot into a short period of time here. My deepest thanks to Miguel Luciano and James Doyle for this absolutely fascinating conversation. And behind the scenes, I want to thank Ann Meisinger, who gave us this opportunity, and Andrea Theodore and Alex Zilka, who both supported the presentation of this program. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your interest. And don't miss the opportunity to see Arte del Mar before it closes on June 27th, and keep a sharp eye out for the presentation of Miguel's Met-related exhibition in East Harlem in late July, and also the community celebration on July 31st. Those will be appearing on the Met's website in the next month or so.
And look out for the El Met t-shirts coming soon.
Absolutely.
Support Latinx art acquisitions at the Met.
Keep a sharp eye. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Miguel.